Welcome to Invisible Iceberg. On today's show, we'll explore how Russia, under the leadership of Peter the Great, used its harsh winters as a formidable defense in the Great Northern War. Plus, we discuss the important lessons learned by Sweden's King Charles after underestimating the brutal climate, leading to significant losses on the battlefield. And we delve into the Little Ice Age and its impact on key moments in history. It all starts now on Invisible Iceberg. In 1709, a young Swedish king launched a daring offensive to conquer Russia during one of the hardest winters of the Little Ice Age. After early victories, the troops soon faced the reality of the brutal Russian winter. Did the relentless conditions ultimately decide the fate of the Swedish army? It's just one of the true and fascinating stories in the book, Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History. Joining us right now is AccuWeather founder and executive chairman and author of the book, Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History, Dr. Joel Myers. Thanks for joining us today, Dr. Joel.
My pleasure, Bernie.
All right, let's go way back into the early 1700s. A war broke out between Russia and Sweden. Let's go over the details. What happened?
Well, it's interesting when you look at those components of Europe in those days. We think of Europe today, but it was very different. The total population of the Swedish Empire, Sweden and Finland, was only 3 million people. And Russia itself only had about 12, 13 million people. So much smaller populations than today. But Russia was 15 times the size of Sweden, but Sweden was the dominant power. It controlled not only Sweden and Finland, but some of the surrounding countries. But Russia needed access to warm water ports. Mm-hmm. And so actually Russia attacked Sweden to start the war at around 1700.
So that was the whole reason for the war, that Russia needed warm water ports, and that's why they attacked Sweden to try to get what we would call the Baltic states today, correct?
That's correct, yeah. It was a particularly cold period. Remember, this is the Little Ice Age. Mm-hmm. The Little Ice Age lasted from 1300 to about 1850, and particularly cold period in the early 1700s. So it was a very cold period, and a lot of Russia was icebound, mm-hmm. and they just felt they needed to expand. And Russia was thought of as a backward country, and Sweden, more enlightened, more advanced, thought they could make short shrift of the Russian army. In the beginning, they did for the first several years, and Sweden was confident they were winning. And then, very cold winter, they attacked Russia, and that was the turning point, 1709. They started Sweden with an army of 51,000. Mm-hmm. Now today, 51,000 for a dominant power doesn't seem, but considering the population at the time, that was pretty large and advanced, but Russia had a somewhat bigger army, but less organized. So Sweden attacked, but and they were heading to Moscow. Very cold, usual thing. The Russians burned the city to the ground, so there'd be nothing there. So when you look at it, a lot of the troops were lost to sickness and just injury. You didn't have the medical care then. So 51,000 troops between the fighting and the cold. About 1,000 were left. A few years later, retreating into Turkey.
The problem started. The Swedes beat them in July of 1708 in the Battle of Hovsen, and then they went to Ukraine in November. And that's when the problem started.
That's when they began, yeah. The winter started early, it was severe, and even though Ukraine is not as cold as Moscow, very cold, and it's what's happened other times in history. Yeah. It's hard to fight and win against Russia in the Russian winter.
Although one would say if there would be any country that would be prepared for it, it would be the Swedes. It's not like they weren't used to cold, and I'm sure it was very cold there during the Little Ice Age as well.
It was, but remember, more maritime climate there, because so it is much colder on average. Moscow in the interior of Russia than it is in Sweden, Finland, and Norway.
So in the battle of in the Ukraine, it was Poltava in 1709. What ended up happening as the forces from Russia then attacked?
Well, the Swedes lost. Yeah, and they had to retreat. And as I said, the army over time, and mainly due to the cold, but also the combination of the extreme cold and the battles, really wiped out the Swedish army. And Peter won. Russia, it changed the whole dynamics, how people thought of Russia. It changed their image tremendously, and Peter became known as Peter the Great.
The emperor, and then, you know, what the initial thought was is that he wanted to gain those territories in the Baltics. He eventually did, but it wasn't right away, was it?
No, the war went on. Remember, disorganization, but finally it was a 21-year war, and by 1721, Russia had clearly won and got what they wanted, and the whole view of Russia in Europe had changed. And this war is a big deal in Russia. It's taught, been in the history books, and it's something celebrated in Russian history for centuries.
Explain to our viewers how cold that period was in Europe.
Well, in some areas it was averaging 5, 6, 7 degrees below normal. But an average, remember, is day after day after day. That means there were periods when the temperatures were 10, 15, 20 degrees colder than it is now. So it was quite extraordinary and had great impact. And again, you have to put it in the context. There were no machines, no planes, no ways to get around like there are today. Travel was difficult, and when the ground is frozen and it's cold, and people didn't have clothes like they do today, keep warm. They were huddled around fires and try to have something to eat.
All right, great stuff, Dr. Joe. Now, you'll be joining us again in a few minutes for our What If section, but just some interesting information about Peter the Great. Thanks for joining us.
And wars in Europe.
And wars in Europe. We'll come back more about that coming up in the next few minutes.
Okay.
All right, here now with more perspective is Lynn Hartnett, professor of Russian history at Villanova University. Professor Hartnett, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thanks for having me.
You know, everybody has heard of Peter the Great. I want you to let us know who he was.
Well, Peter the Great was a force of nature. He had a turbulent life. He was born at a time when he was able to enjoy being an absolute monarch, and he took full advantage of that. He was tireless. He had a will to transform his country in a way that he saw fit, and it didn't matter what the costs were in order to do it.
What was the overall goal of the war, and how did it initially go?
So the overall goal was for Peter and Russia to gain access to the Baltic Sea. Sweden controlled land, the entire eastern shore of the Baltic. They had territory in Finland, what was then considered Livonia. And Peter, for trade and military purposes, needed access to the sea. He was interested in building a navy, and that was critical. And so he thought the time was right to try to take advantage of this young, inexperienced king and conquer Sweden. It didn't go well from the start, but eventually Peter and the Russians are able, with the help of a little scorched earth policy and some fortunate weather conditions, to defeat Charles XII once and for all.
What role did the weather play in this conflict?
So it plays a really large role. In the winter of 1708 and 1709 was often called the worst winter in memory. Temperatures in the plains of what's now Ukraine, where Charles XII and his military was camped out, got as low as 5 degrees. There were accounts of terrible despite soldiers losing their noses, their ears, their fingers, their toes. In addition, hundreds of men in the Swedish army died from the elements. They had no protection from the elements during this really harsh winter, and from the disease and famine that came from the scorched earth policy of having nothing to live off of. After the victory over the Swedes at Poltava in 1709, Peter was able to get the support from European powers that he wanted and he needed. After that point, it became hard for any power in Europe to ignore Russia, which was now the Russian Empire.
Lynn Harnett, professor of Russian history at Villanova University. Thanks again for joining us today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Still to come, we look at how the Little Ice Age was a catalyst for major events that transformed Europe. But up next, find out how Russia's cold winters played a critical role in not only this war, but other conflicts throughout the ages. Welcome back to Invisible Iceberg. I'm Bernie Rayno. Joining me again is AccuWeather founder and executive chairman and author of the book Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History, Dr. Joel Myers. And let's talk about this war pertaining to Peter the Great. What do you think the important lessons are to be learned from this war? There's always lessons in any conflict, but let's talk about this war. What were the lessons that were learned?
It's a chapter in the book because the weather obviously played, and the climate, a major role in the outcome of history and the war in Europe. And this was 1709, a very cold winter, and the Swedes were a dominant power. Russia was a backward country considered. They won the war, and one of the key reasons Russia won the war was the very cold conditions in Russia and Ukraine. Even though Sweden, well, it's a northern power, I mean, they're used to cold, yeah, they are, but it's a different kind of cold. It's not as extreme. It's more maritime climate. Once you get into the interior, it's much colder. And this was a very cold winter, very cold fall. In a very cold period of the Little Ice Age. But also we know that over 100 years later, in 1812, Napoleon attacked Russia. And Napoleon gathered a tremendous army, attacked Russia, cold, very cold. He was defeated. That was the end of Napoleon. Hitler supposedly was prepared, didn't want to fall into that trap, although the Russian meteorologist told him it would not be a cold winter. He could attack this year because it had been 3 cold, and he'd never get 4 in a row. Thank goodness he had that bad information and lost the war. But it was, in that case, it was devastating. You think about, there were 8 million people died. 8 million soldiers and people died with that invasion between Russia and Germany. So in all 3 cases, Russia was attacked in the wintertime. And in all 3 cases, it was not only the Russian army, but importantly, or most importantly, it was the extreme cold that defeated the invader.
It's kind of uncanny, isn't it? That the history just keeps repeating itself when it comes to invading Russia in the wintertime, doesn't it?
Well, there was a famous historian who said, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And here's a classic example.
Well, let's talk about Peter the Great, because this is the war that actually coined him Peter the Great, correct?
That's correct. That's how he got. Now, there's a rumor that his mother gave him that title, but in all, he was known as Peter the Great because Russia was, up to that point, considered a backward country, was considered not a force at all, even though it was huge territorially and had more people than Sweden. But Sweden was more advanced intellectually and with the arts and culture and organization. And so Sweden dominated and up to that point. And after they lost that war, they were not considered a power again.
It's also interesting, another a lesson to learn is never underestimate your opponent. And it seems as though King Charles, who was the king of Sweden, he absolutely believed that they would not pose a problem in this war to them, did he not?
Well, that's correct. Yeah. Well, once a war starts, and in all fairness, the Russians started it, so many times in history, wars don't turn out the way a lot of people think they're going to. And
this, it's interesting. At the end of the chapter in this book, I want to read this to you because I find this very interesting. This comes, again, this is chapter 18 of Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History. Henry Kissinger described Russia's global ambitions as having a special rhythm of its own over the centuries, expanding over landmass, interrupted occasionally over time, only to return again like the tide crossing the beach. That pretty much describes it well, doesn't it?
Well, it certainly describes what, as he viewed back several hundred years of history of Russia, yeah.
And as you mentioned, this changed the perception of Russia going forward. And it was, I guess one could argue that this was the beginning of making Russia, and then, of course, the Soviet Union, eventually a superpower.
That's right, and it changed Russia. Not only did it change the image of Europeans to Russia, but Russia itself. Then education became more important, cultural, so it transformed Russia as well, and they became less rural, less backward, and became more advanced, and that was really the start of it, winning that war. And they advanced through the 1700s, 1800s with art, literature, music, and so on.
It's just so interesting that not only did the weather play a role in it, but the way in which the Russian forces, especially when they were up against Germany and then here against Sweden, it wasn't just the weather, but they destroyed everything when they retreated so that the invading army had nothing that it could use.
Well, that's right. It wasn't only a call, but it was their tactic. They refused to be captured, so they burned in both cases in World War II, and also I think to some extent in 1812, and then certainly when the Swedes invaded, burned Moscow to the ground. They didn't leave anything behind. They were prepared to rebuild it afterwards. So it doesn't pay to attack Russian territory.
I was going to say, if there's one lesson to learn, never attack Russia, especially in the wintertime, and never underestimate your opponents, correct?
That's correct. That's good advice in all aspects of life.
Yeah. I want to thank AccuWeather founder and executive chairman and author of the book Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History, Dr. Joel Myers, for joining us today. After the break, we'll take a look back at the Little Ice Age and its environmental and cultural impacts. Welcome back to Invisible Iceberg. I'm Bernie Rayno. The Little Ice Age, spanning from approximately 1300 to 1850, marked a significant cooling period in the Northern Hemisphere. This area brought dramatic changes to the environment and human life. In Europe, major rivers like the Thames in London and the Seine in Paris frequently froze over during the winter, paving the way for ice fairs and markets on the ice. Glaciers advanced in regions such as the Alps, Scandinavia, and the Andes, encroaching on villages and farmlands. The Little Ice Age brought exceptionally harsh winters, leading to crop failures, food shortages, and famines, causing significant social and economic stress. Notable historical events were influenced by the climate, including the Viking abandonment of Greenland, the isolation of Iceland due to increased sea ice, and the struggles of early European settlers in North America. The cooler climate influenced art and literature, with famous Dutch painter Peter Bruegel the Elder depicting winter scenes with ice skaters and snow-covered landscapes. Agricultural saw shifts as cooler temperatures led to the failure of some crops and the rise of hardy grains, forcing communities to adapt to their farming practices. The challenging conditions spurred innovations in agricultural and infrastructure, including more efficient farming techniques and better housing insulation. Other innovations included the widespread use of buttons, and buttonholes, custom-made knitted undergarments, and the invention of chimneys to replace open fires. That's our show for today. For more information and get your copy of the book Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History by Dr. Joel Myers, go to invisibleiceberg.com.